You're listening to The Best of Perry Gauthier, where we remember our friend and leader who was taken from us in this life in December of 2020. It is our hope that his memory lives on in the hundreds and thousands of people who he touched both in and outside of capitals in this country and around the world. Perry was always prepared to share the good news of Christ and God's love for politicians and people serving in the political realm. Today's episode is shorter, but it is oh so good and filled with great information as Perry talks about the importance of praying for political leaders in office.
One of the few things the Bible commands us to do in regard to government is to pray. In 1 Timothy 2, 1 through 4, Paul says, first of all of importance, pray for kings and those in political authority. And it'll affect our culture, he says. And then in verse 3, he says, for this is well-pleasing in the sight of God our Savior, who desires all men to be saved. So God desires the kings of the earth and political leaders and authorities to be saved. And he commands his people not to grumble, not to complain, not to worry, not to bite their fingernails, but to pray, pray, pray. And I think if there's going to be change in the country, it's got to be because God will hear the prayers of obedient Christians praying for government officials. Not necessarily against them, but that's not all wrong. You look at the imprecatory Psalms and you see great evil and God's people crying against evil. That's not all wrong. But this passage instructs us to pray for our leaders. And there's a saying I love, right living comes from right thinking, and right thinking comes from thinking rightly about God. Well, our founders and framers of our country really did think rightly. They weren't perfect people, but they gave us a good and godly heritage. Really, they rose to the top out of a culture that was good and godly. And God blessed it. And he put his magic wand, so to speak, of blessing on this country, and we become the most powerful country in the world. We started with a godly base, and that is really the essence. And we know pastorally and theologically, that's the essence of what our country needs.
A good and godly heritage indeed, and that is our prayer that is restored in America, and we're able to bring that around the world. Next week's episode came from a conversation Perry and I had about why people don't get engaged in politics that are believers, and it mainly boils down to people think that politics is secular and thus stay out of it. Well, Perry is going to take on that conversation next week in an episode we filmed called Is Politics Secular or Societal? We look forward to dropping that next Wednesday.